The echo of her scream died against the cold stone walls as Josephine Archer realized she had made a terrible mistake. The lantern that had guided her path through the winding cave tunnels beneath Greeley, Colorado, had flickered out, leaving her in absolute darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing against her eyes. It was May of 1878, and what had begun as a curious adventure had quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. "Hello, is anyone there?" Josephine called out, her voice bouncing back at her from unseen walls. She had always been headstrong, a quality her father both admired and lamented. When she'd heard tales of ancient Indian artifacts hidden in the cave system that sprawled beneath the rolling hills outside of town, she couldn't resist exploring. Now that decision might cost her life. Josephine moved cautiously, one hand trailing along the rough wall beside her, the other stretched out before her. The hem of her dress was caked with mud, her boots soaked through from crossing an underground stream. She had no idea how long she had been wandering, but the panic rising in her chest suggested it had been hours. "Keep calm," she whispered to herself. "Someone will come looking eventually." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they might not be true. She had told no one of her plans, not even Martha, her closest friend. The admission stung almost as much as the reality of her predicament. Lucas Miller tightened the cinch on his saddle and patted his bay gelding's neck. The horse, Chance, snorted and pawed at the ground, eager to be on their way. Lucas had spent 3 days tracking a small herd of mustangs through the rocky terrain west of Greeley, hoping to catch a few to break and sell. It was how he'd made his living since coming to Colorado 2 years ago, leaving behind a failed farm in Kansas and a broken heart. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber. Lucas considered making camp where he was, but something a feeling he couldn't quite name urged him to continue toward town. He'd learned long ago to trust his instincts. He was passing near the entrance to what locals called the Devil's Maw, a cave opening set into the side of a low hill, when he heard it faint but unmistakable a woman's voice calling for help. Lucas reined Chance to a stop, tilting his head to listen more carefully. There it was again, echoing out from the dark mouth of the cave. "Hello," he called back, dismounting quickly and securing Chance to a nearby juniper. "Who's in there?" The answer came back distorted by the cave's acoustics. "Oh, thank God, please help me, I'm lost." Without hesitation, Lucas retrieved a torch from his saddlebag, along with matches and his Colt revolver. He had explored parts of these caves before and knew they could be treacherous. He also knew they were rumored to be used occasionally by outlaws hiding from the law. "I'm coming in," he shouted. "Keep talking so I can follow your voice." Josephine nearly wept with relief when she heard the man's response. She had been wandering for what felt like an eternity, each passageway looking identical to the last in the suffocating darkness. "I'm here," she called back, her voice cracking with emotion. "I've been lost for hours. My lantern went out and I can't find my way back." She continued calling out, describing where she thought she might be, though in truth, she had no idea. Every step she had taken after losing her light had been guided by nothing more than desperate hope. Lucas lit his torch, the sudden flare of light momentarily blinding him. The entrance to the cave was wide enough for him to enter without stooping, but the ceiling quickly lowered as he moved deeper inside. The air grew cooler, damper with each step. "Keep talking," he called out, his voice reverberating against the stone walls. "I'm trying to move toward you," Josephine responded, "but there are so many tunnels. I crossed a stream some time ago, and after that, I completely lost my bearings." Lucas knew the stream she mentioned. It cut through the cave system about a quarter mile in, which meant she had wandered quite deep into the labyrinth. He moved carefully, noting markings on the walls, some natural, others left by previous explorers to ensure he could find his way back out. The torch cast dancing shadows that played tricks on his eyes, making him think he saw movement where there was none. The cave branched in 3 directions at one point, and he paused, listening intently. "Can you hear me?" he called out. "I'm at a fork in the path." "Yes." "Your voice sounds closer now," came the reply from the leftmost tunnel. "I think I can see a faint light." Lucas followed the sound, ducking to avoid stalactites that hung like stone daggers from the ceiling. The passageway narrowed until he had to turn sideways to continue. The torch held out before him to light the way. And then suddenly, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and there she was, a young woman with dark hair that had come loose from its pins, her blue dress torn and dirty, but her eyes bright with relief in the torchlight. "You found me," Josephine breathed, almost unable to believe someone had actually come. She had begun to think she would die in the darkness, alone and forgotten. Lucas was momentarily struck by the woman's beauty, even in her disheveled state. She couldn't be much more than 20 years old, with a delicate oval face and expressive eyes that revealed both her fear and her strength. "Lucas Miller," he said, tipping his hat out of habit. "Seems like you've had quite an adventure, miss." "Josephine Archer," she replied, then added with a weak attempt at humor, "though I'd prefer our meeting had occurred under different circumstances." Lucas smiled, his face kind beneath the shadow of his hat. "Most folks just call me Luke, and I'm glad I happened by when I did." "These caves aren't a place to wander alone, especially without proper light." Josephine nodded, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I realize that now. I had a lantern, but the oil ran out faster than I anticipated. I thought I knew the way well enough to get back out, but—" She gestured helplessly at their surroundings. "Well, Miss Archer, let's get you out of here and back to town before nightfall," Lucas said, offering her his arm for support. He noticed she was favoring her right ankle slightly. "Are you injured?" he asked. "I turned my ankle on some loose stones when the lantern went out," she admitted. "It's not too bad, but walking has been difficult." Lucas nodded, his expression serious. "The path back isn't easy. We'll take it slow, and you lean on me when you need to." As they began making their way through the twisting passageways, Josephine found herself intensely grateful for this stranger's calm competence. The torch illuminated only a small circle around them, but it was enough to banish the oppressive darkness that had enveloped her for hours. "What brought you into the caves alone?" Lucas asked as they navigated a particularly narrow section of tunnel. Josephine hesitated, unsure whether to share her true purpose. Then again, this man was saving her life. She owed him honesty at the very least. "I've heard stories of artifacts left behind by the native tribes who once lived here," she explained. "I'm something of an amateur historian. My father collects books and historical items, and I suppose I've inherited his curiosity." Lucas glanced at her with new interest. "Most young ladies I know prefer tea parties to cave exploring. I've never been particularly skilled at being what others expect," Josephine replied with a small smile. "My mother despairs of ever finding me a suitable husband." They reached the underground stream, which Lucas crossed first before turning to help Josephine. He lifted her easily across the water, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her despite her exhaustion. "You mentioned your father collects historical items," Lucas said as they continued. "Would that be Thomas Archer, who owns the bookshop on Main Street?" Josephine looked surprised. "Yes, that's my father. Do you know him?" Lucas nodded. "I've purchased a few books there. He has an impressive collection on natural history. Seems like a good man." "He is," Josephine agreed, touched by the cowboy's assessment. "Though he'll be furious when he learns what I've done today. He's always warning me about being too impulsive." "Impulse has its merits," Lucas said with a slight smile. "Though perhaps not when it comes to cave exploration." They fell into companionable silence as the tunnel began to slope upward, a promising sign they were nearing the surface. Josephine's ankle throbbed painfully, but she was determined not to slow their progress more than necessary. When they finally emerged from the cave mouth into the golden light of late afternoon, Josephine felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. She hadn't realized until that moment how terrified she had truly been, buried beneath tons of rock in absolute darkness. Lucas's bay gelding nickered in greeting, and Lucas led Josephine to a flat boulder where she could sit while he gathered his things. "Thank you," she said simply, looking up at him. The sunlight revealed details she hadn't been able to discern in the torchlight: his sun-bronzed skin, the crow's feet at the corners of his blue eyes that suggested he smiled often, the way his light brown hair curled slightly where it met his collar. "Anyone would have done the same," he replied, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. Many men might have ignored the voice, concerned about outlaws or unwilling to risk the dangers of the cave. "How will you get back to town?" Lucas asked, glancing at her injured ankle. "I came on horseback," Josephine said, pointing to a stand of trees some distance away. "My mare should still be tethered there unless she's broken free." Lucas squinted in the direction she indicated. "I don't see any horse. Let me check." He returned a few minutes later, shaking his head. "No sign of her. The reins may have come loose, or someone passing by might have taken her." Josephine's heart sank. Not only would she have to explain her reckless adventure to her parents, but also the loss of her horse. "This day just continues to improve," she muttered. Lucas considered their options. "It's about 5 miles back to Greeley. Your ankle won't hold up for that walk." He gestured to his gelding. "Chance here is strong enough to carry us both, if you're willing, that is." Josephine nodded gratefully. "I don't see that I have much choice, Mr. Miller." "Luke," he reminded her, then helped her to her feet. "Let's get you home before your parents send out a search party." He lifted her onto Chance's back with ease, then mounted behind her. Josephine was acutely aware of his closeness, the solid presence of his chest against her back as he reached around her for the reins. It was highly improper being alone with a man she'd just met, riding together on a single horse, but given the circumstances, propriety seemed a distant concern. As they rode toward town at an easy pace, the late afternoon sun warming their faces, Josephine found herself strangely reluctant for the journey to end. Despite her ordeal, or perhaps because of it, she felt more alive than she had in months. "Will you be staying in Greeley long?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "A while," Lucas replied. "I've been working with wild horses in the area. There's good money in it if you have the patience and skill, and Greeley's as good a place as any to call home for now." "And before Greeley?" Josephine couldn't help her curiosity about this man who had appeared like an answer to her desperate prayers. Lucas was quiet for a moment before answering. "Kansas. Had a farm there with my brother. Lost it after 3 years of drought and grasshoppers. Before that, fought in the war when I was barely more than a boy. Been moving west ever since." The simple accounting of his past spoke volumes about the hardships he had faced. Josephine thought about her own sheltered life in comparison, the comfortable home her father provided, the education she'd received, the security of knowing where her next meal would come from. "I'm sorry about your farm," she said softly. Luke shrugged, a movement she felt rather than saw. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. Sometimes what seems like bad luck at the time leads to better things down the road." As they crested a small rise, the buildings of Greeley came into view, smoke rising from chimneys as families prepared their evening meals. Josephine felt a curious mix of relief and disappointment. Soon she would be back in the fold of her family, her adventure concluded. And Lucas Miller would ride away, their paths unlikely to cross again except in passing on the streets of town. The thought bothered her more than it should have. "My parents' home is at the north end of town," she directed, pointing toward a two-story white house set back from the road. "The one with the blue shutters and the apple trees in the yard." Lucas nodded, guiding Chance in that direction. As they approached, Josephine could see her mother standing on the porch, shading her eyes against the setting sun. When she recognized her daughter riding double with a strange man, her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. "Josephine Mary Archer, where have you been?" Margaret Archer called out, hurrying down the steps as Lucas brought the horse to a stop at the gate. "Your father's been out looking for you for hours. And where is Daisy?" Josephine winced at her mother's tone and the use of her full name, a sure sign she was in serious trouble. Before she could respond, Lucas dismounted and helped her down carefully, mindful of her injured ankle. "Mrs. Archer," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "your daughter had a bit of an accident exploring the cave system west of town. Her horse wandered off, and she injured her ankle. I was fortunate enough to hear her calling for help as I passed by." Margaret's expression softened slightly at his polite explanation, though her eyes still flashed with concern and disapproval when they turned back to her daughter. "Caves? Josephine, what were you thinking? You know those places are dangerous." She took in her daughter's torn and dirty dress, the tangled state of her hair and the exhaustion evident in her face. "Come inside at once. You need to clean up before your father returns. He's been worried sick." Josephine turned to Lucas, suddenly reluctant to part. "I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Miller, if you hadn't come along when you did." "No need to dwell on that," Lucas said gently. "Just promise you won't go cave exploring alone again. Take a friend next time at the very least. And plenty of extra oil for your lantern." Despite everything, Josephine smiled at his words. Not a lecture about proper behavior for a young lady, but practical advice for future adventures. "I promise." Margaret cleared her throat meaningfully, and Josephine realized she had been staring at Lucas longer than was proper. "Mr. Miller," Margaret said, "we'd be honored if you would join us for supper this evening. My husband will want to thank you personally for helping Josephine." Lucas hesitated, glancing down at his dusty clothes. "That's very kind, madam, but I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Margaret insisted. "It's the least we can do. We dine at 7. That should give you time to see to your horse and freshen up if you wish." Lucas looked to Josephine, who nodded encouragingly. "Please come," she said softly. "Then I'd be delighted," he replied with a slight bow. "Until 7 o'clock. As he mounted Chance and rode away, Josephine watched his retreating figure with a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her earlier ordeal. Something told her that her adventure hadn't ended when she emerged from the cave. It had only just begun. Margaret helped her daughter up the porch steps, clucking her tongue at the state of Josephine's dress and the dirt smudged across her face. "That poor man," she muttered, "having to rescue you from your own foolishness. What must he think of you?" "He thinks I'm curious and adventurous," Josephine replied with more confidence than she felt. "Not everyone believes women should be confined to parlors and kitchens, mother." Margaret sighed, a sound Josephine had heard countless times throughout her life. "There's a vast difference between intellectual pursuits and crawling around in caves like some wild creature. Your father indulges your interests far too much." Inside the house, the familiar sense of home enveloped Josephine Beeswax's polish, fresh bread, and the subtle fragrance of her mother's lavender sachets. After the dank, earthy smell of the cave, it was almost overwhelmingly pleasant. "Go upstairs and bathe," Margaret instructed. "I'll have Betsy bring up hot water, and put that dress aside for washing. I'm not sure it can be salvaged, but we'll try." Josephine did as she was told, too weary to argue. As she soaked in the copper tub, washing away the dirt and fear of the day, she found her thoughts repeatedly returning to Lucas Miller. The way he had appeared when she needed him most, his quiet competence, the surprising gentleness in his calloused hands when he helped her over difficult terrain. She had met many men during her 20 years, sons of her father's friends, young men from good families her mother hoped she might consider as potential husbands, traveling salesmen who visited her father's shop. None had affected her the way this cowboy had in the span of a few hours. By the time she dressed for dinner in a simple green frock that brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes, her father had returned home. She could hear his deep voice downstairs, no doubt receiving a full account of her misadventure from her mother. Josephine descended the stairs slowly, still favoring her injured ankle. Her father stood in the parlor, his tall frame silhouetted against the window. When he turned and saw her, his expression was a complex mixture of relief, lingering worry, and the exasperated fondness that characterized most of their interactions. "Josephine," Thomas Archer said, opening his arms to her, "your mother tells me you decided to become a cave explorer today." She went to him, accepting his embrace and the comfort it offered. "I'm sorry I worried you, Father. It was reckless, I know." Thomas held her at arm's length, studying her face. "You might have been lost forever if that young man hadn't heard you." "What were you thinking, going into those caves alone?" "I was thinking about the stories you told me of the artifacts found there," she admitted. "I wanted to see for myself, to perhaps find something for your collection." Thomas shook his head, but there was a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Your intentions were admirable, my dear, but your method leaves much to be desired. Promise me you won't undertake such expeditions without proper preparation and company in the future." "I've already promised Mr. Miller the same," Josephine said. "He gave me quite similar advice." "Then he's a sensible man, and I look forward to meeting him," Thomas replied. "Your mother says he'll be joining us for dinner." The doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock. Josephine, who had been arranging flowers on the dining table, a task her mother had assigned to keep her occupied, felt her pulse quicken at the sound. Margaret answered the door, and Josephine heard her welcoming Lucas into their home. When he entered the dining room a moment later, Josephine almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the dust-covered cowboy. In his place stood a clean-shaven gentleman in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, though still curling slightly at the ends. Their eyes met across the room, and the small smile he gave her made her cheeks warm. "Mr. Miller," she greeted him, setting down the vase of daisies she'd been arranging. "You clean up nicely." "Miss Archer," he replied with a slight bow. "I could say the same of you. You look remarkably recovered from your ordeal." Thomas Archer entered the room then, extending his hand to Lucas. "Mr. Miller, I cannot express my gratitude adequately. You saved my daughter from a terrible fate today." Lucas shook his hand firmly. "Any man would have done the same, sir." "I'm just glad I was passing by when I was. Please call me Thomas, and join us at the table. Betsy has prepared a roast to celebrate my daughter's safe return." Dinner was a more pleasant affair than Josephine had anticipated. Lucas, though clearly more at home on the range than in a dining room, conducted himself with quiet dignity. He answered her father's questions about his work with horses, shared stories of his travels across the Western Territories, and even managed to make her mother laugh with a tale about a particularly stubborn mule he'd encountered in Wyoming. As the evening progressed, Josephine found herself increasingly drawn to him. There was a depth to Lucas Miller that belied his simple occupation. He spoke knowledgeably about the natural history of the region, the various Indian tribes he'd encountered, and displayed a keen interest in her father's collection of historical texts and artifacts. When Thomas invited Lucas to see his library after dinner, Josephine accompanied them, eager to continue their conversation. Her mother, seeming to sense the growing connection between her daughter and their guest, watched with a mixture of concern and resigned acceptance. In the library, surrounded by her father's beloved books and collection of historical items, Lucas appeared truly in his element. He examined a Cheyenne pipe with appreciative eyes and listened intently as Thomas explained the significance of various artifacts. "You have an impressive knowledge of native cultures," Thomas commented, observing Lucas's informed questions. Lucas shrugged modestly. "I've spent time with several tribes during my travels. They've been generous in sharing their knowledge with me when I showed genuine interest and respect." "That's more than can be said for many who come west," Thomas replied, his expression somber. "Too many see only savages where there are complex societies with rich histories." "Father has always taught me to look beyond surface appearances," Josephine added, moving to stand beside Lucas as he examined a display of arrowheads. "To seek understanding rather than rush to judgment." "A valuable lesson," Lucas said, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the artifacts, "and one that served me well in my own life." The evening ended too soon for Josephine's liking. As Lucas prepared to depart, thanking her parents for their hospitality, she found herself searching for a reason to see him again. "Mr. Miller," she said as he retrieved his hat from the hall stand, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding cave exploration. About taking a friend next time." She hesitated, then continued with more confidence. "Would you perhaps consider being that friend? With your knowledge of the area, we might make some significant discoveries." Lucas looked surprised by the invitation, and her mother made a small sound of dismay behind her. But it was her father who spoke first. "That seems like an excellent idea," Thomas said, earning a sharp glance from his wife. "Mr. Miller clearly knows his way around those caves, and I'd feel much better knowing Josephine wasn't exploring alone. Of course, with proper equipment and planning this time." Lucas considered for a moment, then nodded. "I'd be happy to accompany you, Miss Archer, provided your parents approve. The caves do hold many wonders worth seeing when approached safely." Margaret, realizing she was outnumbered, sighed in defeat. "I suppose if you're determined to continue these explorations, Josephine, having Mr. Miller along would at least give me some peace of mind. But I insist on proper preparations and returning well before dark." Josephine beamed at this unexpected victory. "Of course, Mother. We'll be exceedingly careful." Lucas placed his hat on his head, tipping it politely to them all. "I'll call again at the end of the week if that suits. By then, your ankle should be properly healed, Miss Archer." "Perfect," Josephine replied, unable to keep the enthusiasm from her voice. "And please call me Josephine. After today's adventure, formality seems unnecessary." "Josephine," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "Then you must call me Luke." After he had gone, Margaret turned to her daughter with knowing eyes. "That young man is more than just a potential cave-exploring companion to you, isn't he?" Josephine felt her cheeks flush, but met her mother's gaze steadily. "He saved my life today, Mother, and he's unlike anyone I've ever met. Is it so wrong that I want to know him better?" Thomas placed a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder. "Mr. Miller seems a good sort, Margaret. resourceful, intelligent, and respectful. Those are rare qualities in combination. He's a cowboy, Margaret pointed out, though with less disapproval than Josephine had expected. Hardly the stable future we've discussed for Josephine. He's a man who makes his own way in the world, Thomas countered, and who possesses the good sense to appreciate our daughter's spirited nature rather than trying to subdue it. He smiled at Josephine. I'm not suggesting you plan the wedding yet, my dear, but I see no harm in allowing this friendship to develop naturally. Josephine embraced her father gratefully. Thank you for understanding. That night, as she lay in bed, Josephine replayed the events of the day in her mind. The terror of being lost in the darkness, the relief at hearing Lucas's voice, the comfort of his steady presence guiding her back to safety. And then dinner, seeing a different side of him, educated and thoughtful, comfortable discussing history and natural science with her father. She fell asleep with a smile on her lips, dreaming not of dark caves but of sun-drenched prairies, and the man who had followed the sound of her voice. The days, until their planned expedition, passed slowly for Josephine. Her ankle improved steadily with rest, and by Thursday she was walking without pain. She spent her time helping in her father's bookshop, organizing new arrivals and assisting customers, all the while wondering what Lucas was doing, whether he thought of her as often as she thought of him. On Friday afternoon, the shop door opened and Lucas stepped inside. He wore simpler clothes than he had at dinner, a clean work shirt, denims, and his usual boots, but he had shaved, and his hat was free of dust. "Luke," Josephine greeted him, pleasure evident in her voice. "I didn't expect you until tomorrow. I finished my work earlier than anticipated," he explained, approaching the counter where she stood. "And I wanted to discuss our plans for the exploration, if you have time, that is." Thomas emerged from the back room, a stack of ledgers in his arms. "Ah, Mr. Miller, good to see you again. I hope you've come to talk some sense into my daughter about proper cave exploring techniques." Lucas smiled. "That's exactly why I'm here, sir. I've been thinking about the best approach for a safe but productive expedition." "Then by all means, take Josephine for a walk and discuss your strategy," Thomas suggested. "I can manage the shop for the remainder of the afternoon." Josephine looked at her father with surprise and gratitude. He winked at her, a silent acknowledgement of his support for her interest in Lucas. "Let me get my shawl," she said, already moving toward the coat rack by the door. They walked through town side by side, not touching but close enough that Josephine was acutely aware of Lucas's presence beside her. He had a natural, easy stride that she found herself matching without effort. "How's your ankle?" he asked as they turned onto a tree-lined street leading toward the park at the center of town. "Much better, thank you. No lingering effects from my misadventure, apart from a newfound respect for proper lighting in dark places." Lucas chuckled. "A valuable lesson, to be sure. I've brought 2 lanterns for tomorrow, with extra oil and proper ropes. I've also marked the safest paths through the main sections of the cave system on a map." Josephine was touched by his thorough preparation. "You've gone to considerable trouble." "I take my promises seriously," he replied. "Especially when they involve the safety of someone I—" He paused, seemed to reconsider his words. "Someone I respect." The almost confession hung between them as they reached the park and followed a gravel path beneath a canopy of cottonwood trees. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the warm spring breeze. An elderly couple sat on a bench, feeding crumbs to sparrows. "Tell me more about your interest in historical artifacts," Lucas said after a comfortable silence. "It's an unusual passion for a young woman." Josephine considered her answer carefully. "I've always been fascinated by the stories objects tell us about the past. Each arrowhead, each pot shard, represents a person who lived and worked and dreamed, not so different from us. History isn't just dates and battles in dusty books, it's the accumulated experiences of countless individuals, each leaving their mark on the world, however small. Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. I've had similar thoughts watching the sun set behind ancient cliff dwellings, or finding stone tools half buried in riverbeds. You can almost feel the presence of those who came before. Exactly, Josephine exclaimed, delighted by his understanding. That's what I'm seeking when I explore that connection to the past, that reminder that we're part of something larger than our own brief lives. They had stopped walking, facing each other on the path. The dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves above them cast shifting patterns across Lucas's face, highlighting the earnestness in his blue eyes. "You're quite remarkable, Josephine Archer," he said softly. "Most people see only what's right in front of them. You see across time." She felt her cheeks warm at his praise. "And you're not what I expected when a cowboy rescued me from a cave, Lucas Miller." His lips quirked in a smile. "And what did you expect? Someone less?" She gestured vaguely with one hand. "Less thoughtful, less interested in history and science. More concerned with cattle and horses than ideas and artifacts." "I contain multitudes, as Mr. Whitman would say," Lucas replied, surprising her with the literary reference. At her raised eyebrows, he added, "I read when I can." "The life of a cowboy involves more hours alone with your thoughts than most people realize." They resumed walking, and Josephine found herself sharing stories of her childhood, her education at a ladies' academy in Denver, her frustration with the limited options society offered women of her station. In turn, Lucas spoke of his youth in Pennsylvania, his experiences during the war, the loss of his parents to influenza, and his decision to seek a new beginning in the West with his brother Michael. "And your brother, is he still in Kansas?" Josephine asked. Lucas's expression darkened slightly. "No. After we lost the farm, he headed to California. We write occasionally, but he's never been one to stay in one place for long. Unlike you, have you found your place here in Greeley?" The question held more significance than Josephine had intended, and she waited for his answer with unexpected tension. "I believe I might have," Lucas said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "There's something about this town that feels right. Or perhaps it's the people in it." Before Josephine could respond to his implied meaning, they were interrupted by a familiar voice calling her name. Martha Reynolds, her closest friend, was approaching rapidly, curiosity evident in her expression. "Josephine." "I've been looking everywhere for you," Martha exclaimed, her eyes darting between Josephine and Lucas with undisguised interest. "Your mother mentioned you'd gone walking with a friend." Josephine made the introductions, noting Martha's appreciative assessment of Lucas and feeling an unexpected stab of possessiveness. "Luke rescued me when I got lost in the caves west of town earlier this week," she explained. "We're planning a proper expedition tomorrow with adequate supplies this time." Martha's eyebrows rose. "The caves! Josie, you didn't tell me about any of this, and now you're going back. With proper preparation and an experienced guide," Josephine assured her, gesturing to Lucas. "Would you like to join us? 3 explorers are surely safer than 2. The invitation was sincere. Martha was her dearest friend, after all, but Josephine felt a conflicting hope that she would decline. To her relief, Martha shook her head. "Thank you, but I have no desire to scramble around underground in the dark. My idea of adventure is a new novel from back east." She gave Lucas a curious look. "Though I can certainly understand the appeal of having a handsome guide." Lucas cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable with Martha's forwardness. "Miss Reynolds, it's been a pleasure meeting you, but I should be getting back to my work. Josephine, shall I call for you tomorrow morning around 9? Josephine nodded, disappointed that their walk was ending but understanding his discomfort. 9 would be perfect. I'll be ready. After Lucas had departed with a tip of his hat, Martha linked her arm through Josephine's and demanded every detail of their meeting and subsequent interactions. Josephine shared the story of her cave misadventure and rescue, though she kept certain aspects of her growing feelings for Lucas private. "He's certainly easy on the eyes," Martha commented as they walked back toward Main Street. "And clearly educated, despite his profession. Your mother must be having fits." "She's been surprisingly accepting," Josephine replied. "Father seems to like him, which helps, and Luke has been nothing but respectful." Martha studied her friend's face. "You're quite taken with him, aren't you? I can see it in your eyes when you speak his name." Josephine couldn't deny it. "There's something about him, Martha. A depth, a thoughtfulness. And when he found me in that cave, the relief I felt seeing his light in the darkness, I've never experienced anything like it. Being rescued by a handsome cowboy is certainly the stuff of penny novels," Martha teased gently. "Just be careful with your heart, Josie. Men like that who roam from place to place breaking horses, they don't always stay put." "He says he feels at home in Greeley," Josephine said, but Martha's warning had struck a nerve. Lucas had indeed lived a nomadic life thus far. What assurance did she have that he wouldn't move on when the next opportunity arose? That question lingered in her mind for the remainder of the day and into the night. By the time morning arrived, however, Josephine's excitement about their cave expedition had pushed her doubts aside. She dressed practically in her plainest skirt and a sturdy shirtwaist, with boots well suited for walking over rough terrain. Her mother insisted she wear a hat to protect her from the sun during their journey to and from the caves, though Josephine knew it would be more hindrance than help once they were underground. Lucas arrived precisely at 9, riding Chance and leading a gentle-looking mare. "Good morning," he greeted her, dismounting with fluid grace. "I've borrowed this lady from a friend for you to ride. Her name's Willow, and she has a much calmer disposition than that flighty mare of yours." The lost horse, Daisy, had been found wandering near town the day after Josephine's misadventure and was now safely back in her family's stable. Josephine approached the mare, stroking her velvety nose. "She's beautiful. Thank you for arranging this." Lucas helped her mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent a now familiar warmth through her, and from the way his gaze lingered on her face before he stepped back, she suspected he felt it too. They rode side by side out of town, the morning sun warm on their backs. Lucas had packed provisions, water, bread, cheese, and dried fruit, as well as the promised lanterns, ropes, and a detailed map of the cave system he had drawn himself. "Have you explored these caves often?" Josephine asked as they rode. Lucas nodded. "Several times. They extend for miles beneath these hills, with chambers and passages still unmapped. The local tribes consider them sacred places, doorways to the underworld. They use certain chambers for ceremonies, though those practices have largely died out with the confinement of the tribes to reservations." The reminder of the often brutal treatment of the native peoples sobered Josephine. "It seems we're always losing knowledge and traditions before we've had the chance to understand their value." "That's why documentation is so important," Lucas agreed. "Recording what remains before it's gone forever. It's one of the reasons I respect your father's work collecting and preserving artifacts and accounts." They reached the cave entrance around mid-morning. Lucas secured the horses in a shady spot with access to water and grass, then unpacked their equipment. "Before we enter," he said seriously, "we need to establish some rules. Stay within sight of me at all times. If we become separated, remain where you are and call out. Don't try to find your way alone. We'll use rope to mark our path, and we'll turn back with plenty of daylight remaining for our return to town." Josephine nodded, appreciating his thoroughness. "I've learned my lesson about cave exploration, I assure you." Lucas lit both lanterns, handing one to Josephine. "Ready for adventure, properly prepared this time." "More than ready," she replied with a smile, and together they entered the darkness. The cave felt different with Lucas beside her, and a reliable light in her hand. What had been terrifying in her solitary wanderings now became wondrous, the glittering mineral deposits catching the lantern light, the strange formations created by water and time, the perfect silence broken only by the occasional drip of water or their own soft voices. Lucas guided her through passageways she hadn't seen before, pointing out features of interest: a wall where ancient hands had left painted symbols, a chamber where the ceiling rose so high their lanterns couldn't illuminate it fully, a narrow corridor that opened suddenly into a vast room filled with stalactites and stalagmites that resembled a stone forest. "This is breathtaking," Josephine whispered, her voice still echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "I had no idea such beauty existed beneath our feet." Lucas watched her face as she took in the surroundings, finding her wonder as captivating as the cave itself. "Most people never see these places. They live their whole lives on the surface, unaware of the hidden world below." Josephine turned to him, her eyes bright in the lantern light. "Thank you for showing me, for turning what could have been simply a frightening memory into something magical." They stood close together in the dim light, surrounded by the silent testimony of geological processes that had been occurring for millennia before humans first walked the earth. In that moment, the connection between them seemed as natural and inevitable as the formation of the stone columns surrounding them. Lucas reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You make it easy to see the world with fresh eyes, Josephine, to remember there's beauty and wonder everywhere if we're willing to look for it." She leaned slightly into his touch, her heart racing. "Even in dark caves where foolish young women get themselves lost." "Especially there," he murmured, and then, with gentle deliberation, he leaned forward and kissed her. The kiss was soft, questioning, over almost as soon as it began. Lucas drew back, studying her face for any sign of offense or regret. Finding none, he smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious features. "I've been wanting to do that since I found you in this cave," he admitted quietly. Josephine felt a bubble of happiness rise within her. "I'm glad you waited until I wasn't terrified and covered in mud." Lucas laughed, the sound echoing around the chamber. "You were beautiful even then, though I tried not to notice given the circumstances." They continued their exploration, but something had shifted between them. Their hands found each other naturally as they navigated narrow passages, lingering in contact longer than necessary. They sat side by side to share the lunch Lucas had packed, their shoulders touching, conversation flowing easily between topics serious and light. In a smaller chamber branching off from the main path, Josephine discovered what she had originally come seeking: a collection of pottery shards embedded in the cave floor, clearly very old and decorated with intricate patterns, unlike any she had seen in her father's collection. "Luke, look at these," she exclaimed, kneeling to examine the fragments more closely. "They appear to be much older than the artifacts typically found in this region. The design work is extraordinary." Lucas knelt beside her, holding his lantern closer to illuminate the pieces. "You're right. These don't match the pottery styles of the tribes known to have inhabited this area in recent centuries. This could be an important find. Josephine carefully extracted several of the larger fragments, wrapping them in her handkerchief. Father will be fascinated. He's been corresponding with archaeologists at Eastern universities about the prehistory of this region. You have a good eye, Lucas commented. Most people would have walked right past these, thinking them just broken bits of clay. Most people aren't looking for stories in the dirt, Josephine replied with a smile. As you've observed, I tend to see things differently than most. They marked the location of the find on Lucas's map before continuing deeper into the cave system. Time seemed to behave differently underground, with no sun to mark its passage, but Lucas kept careful track of the hours, ensuring they would have plenty of daylight for their return journey. As they made their way back toward the entrance, following the rope markers they had placed earlier, Josephine found herself reluctant for the day to end. Their expedition had been everything she had hoped for: fascinating discoveries, breathtaking natural wonders, and the deepening of her connection with Lucas. They emerged from the cave into late afternoon sunlight, blinking as their eyes adjusted after hours in the dim lantern light. The horses nickered a greeting, eager to return home. "Successful expedition?" Lucas asked as he packed away their equipment. Josephine nodded, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Beyond my expectations. The pottery fragments alone make it worthwhile, but seeing those incredible formations, learning about how the caves were formed, it was all remarkable." She paused, then added more softly, "The company was quite agreeable as well." Lucas smiled at that, stepping closer to her. "I was thinking the same." He took her hands in his expression growing more serious. "Josephine, I'd like to call on you properly if you'll allow it, not just for cave exploring or historical discussions, though I enjoy those immensely, but to court you, as the saying goes." The directness of his statement took Josephine by surprise, though not unpleasantly. "I'd like that very much," she replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. Lucas's smile returned, brighter than before. "Your parents might have reservations about my suitability. I'm not a wealthy man, and my profession isn't the most stable." "They've already seen the kind of man you are," Josephine assured him. "And while my mother might have preferred a banker or lawyer for me, I think she recognizes that I would wither in such a conventional match." She squeezed his hands. "Besides, Father already approves of you, which is half the battle won." Lucas laughed and lifted one of her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Then I'll speak with him when we return." The ride back to Greeley was filled with easy conversation and shared laughter. Josephine found herself imagining future expeditions not just to caves but to other places of historical or natural interest, with Lucas by her side. For the first time, the prospect of a romantic attachment didn't feel like the beginning of confinement as it had with previous suitors, but rather the expansion of possibilities. When they reached the Archer home, Thomas was in the front yard, pruning the apple trees. He waved in greeting as they approached, his expression curious but welcoming. "Successful adventure," he called out as Lucas helped Josephine dismount. "Very," Josephine replied, hurrying to show him the carefully wrapped pottery fragments. "Look what we found, Father." "I believe these may be significantly older than the usual artifacts from this region." Thomas examined the pieces with expert interest, turning them carefully in his hands. "Extraordinary craftsmanship. And you're right about the age. The patterns don't match anything in my reference books on local tribes." He looked up at Lucas with newfound respect. "You have a good eye for historical significance, Mr. Miller." "The discovery was entirely Josephine's," Lucas replied honestly. "I was merely the guide." Thomas nodded approvingly at this acknowledgement of his daughter's abilities. "Well, you make a good team, clearly. Margaret has prepared dinner if you'd care to join us again, Mr. Miller. I'm sure she'd like to hear about your expedition as well." Lucas glanced at Josephine, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd be honored, sir. And if you have a moment, there's something I'd like to discuss with you privately." Thomas's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Of course. Let's put these horses in the stable first, and then we can talk in my study." Josephine watched them walk toward the small stable behind the house, her heart full of hope and excitement for what the future might hold. The day had been perfect discovery, adventure, and the promise of love with a man who understood and valued her exactly as she was. As the weeks passed, Lucas became a regular visitor at the Archer home. He called on Josephine several evenings a week, sometimes accompanying her and her parents to community events, other times simply sitting with her on the porch swing, talking until the stars emerged in the night sky. On Sundays after church, they often rode out to explore the countryside around Greeley, visiting ancient buffalo jumps, examining rock formations, or sometimes simply finding a shady spot by the river to read and talk. Lucas proved to be as interested in literature as he was in natural history, engaging Josephine in lively debates about the merits of various authors and philosophies. Margaret, who had initially harbored reservations about the match, gradually warmed to Lucas as she observed his consistent respectfulness and genuine care for Josephine. It didn't hurt that he always arrived promptly, dressed neatly, and never failed to bring small tokens of appreciation: wildflowers for Margaret, interesting geological specimens for Thomas, and books of poetry or history for Josephine. By midsummer, it was common knowledge in Greeley that Miss Josephine Archer was being courted by the horse trainer Lucas Miller, and that the match had the blessing of her parents. Some townspeople raised eyebrows at the pairing of the bookshop owner's educated daughter with a cowboy, but those who knew them understood the compatibility of their curious minds and adventurous spirits. One warm August evening, as they sat beneath the apple trees in the Archer's backyard, Lucas seemed unusually quiet, his thoughts clearly elsewhere despite the pleasant conversation around them. Thomas and Margaret had joined them briefly, but had retired indoors, leaving the young couple alone in the gathering twilight. "You're miles away tonight," Josephine observed, touching Lucas's hand to reclaim his attention. "Is something troubling you?" Lucas turned to her, his blue eyes serious. "Not troubling, exactly. I've been offered an opportunity that I need to consider carefully." A cold knot formed in Josephine's stomach as Martha's warning about wandering cowboys echoed in her mind. "What sort of opportunity?" "The Wilson Ranch northeast of town needs a new foreman," Lucas explained. "Mr. Wilson approached me yesterday. He's been watching my work with the wild horses and says he needs someone with my skills and work ethic. It would mean a stable position, a good wage, and—" He hesitated, then continued more quietly, "a future I could offer to someone else if she were interested in sharing it." The knot in Josephine's stomach dissolved, replaced by a fluttering warmth. "That sounds like an excellent opportunity," she said carefully, not wanting to presume his meaning. Lucas shifted on the bench to face her more directly. "Josephine, these past months have been the happiest of my life. Before I met you, I was content with my nomadic existence, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. But now—" He took both her hands in his. "Now I find myself dreaming of a home, of building something lasting, with you, if you'll have me." Josephine's heart raced as she realized what was happening. "Luke." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small ring with a modest diamond flanked by two small sapphires. This was my mother's. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right time, the right person." His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Josephine Archer, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness sprang to Josephine's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, Luke, I will marry you." Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as though made for her. Then he drew her into his arms, kissing her with a depth of feeling that left her breathless. When they finally separated, Josephine rested her forehead against his. "I should tell you, I had begun to worry you might be planning to leave Greeley. Martha warned me that cowboys don't typically stay in one place." Lucas smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I won't pretend I haven't been restless most of my life. But something changed when I found you in that cave, Josephine. It was as if all my wandering had been leading me to that moment, to you." He kissed her softly again. "Home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a person." They shared their news with her parents that evening, receiving enthusiastic blessings from both. Thomas insisted on opening a bottle of fine whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion, and they toasted to the future, to new beginnings, and to the strange workings of fate that had brought Josephine and Lucas together in the darkness beneath the Colorado hills. The wedding took place in October, when the aspen trees surrounding Greeley had turned to gold, and the air held the first crisp hint of the coming winter. It was a simple ceremony in the town's small church, attended by nearly everyone in Greeley. Martha served as maid of honor, while Lucas's brother Michael, who had traveled from California for the occasion, stood as best man. Josephine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to suit her more modern tastes, with her grandmother's lace veil. Lucas, looking somewhat uncomfortable but undeniably handsome in a new suit, waited for her at the altar with an expression of such reverent joy that several of the ladies in attendance dabbed at their eyes before the ceremony had even begun. Their vows were traditional but spoken with personal conviction. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Lucas kissed his bride, the cheers from the congregation nearly raised the church's roof. The celebration continued at the Archer home, where tables had been set up in the yard beneath strings of lanterns. There was music and dancing, abundant food and drink, and so much goodwill that even Margaret, who had fretted for weeks about the arrangements, was able to relax and enjoy herself. As evening fell, Lucas and Josephine slipped away from the festivities, mounting horses decorated with ribbons and flowers by well-meaning friends. They rode through town amid cheers and well wishes, heading toward the small but comfortable house on the Wilson Ranch that would be their first home together. The house stood on a gentle rise overlooking rolling pastures, with the mountains visible in the distance. Lucas had spent every spare moment of the past 2 months preparing it for Josephine, painting walls, fixing the roof, building shelves for her books, and even planting a small garden that would bloom in the spring. When they arrived, Lucas insisted on tradition, lifting Josephine into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Miller," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the small but cozy front room. Josephine looked around at the simple furnishings, the bookshelves already filled with their combined collections, the curtains her mother had sewn, and the vase of wildflowers on the table, Lucas's final touch before they had left for the church that morning. "It's perfect," she said, turning back to him with shining eyes. "Everything I could have wanted." Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Josephine traced the line of Lucas's jaw with gentle fingers. "Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have unfolded if I hadn't gotten lost in that cave? Or if you hadn't been riding past at exactly the right moment?" Lucas caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I prefer to think it was inevitable somehow. That we would have found each other eventually, though perhaps not in such dramatic fashion." Josephine smiled at the thought. "Still, I'm grateful for that cave, for being foolish enough to explore it alone, and for your good hearing." "As am I," Lucas murmured, drawing her closer. "Though I hope all our future adventures together involve a bit less mortal peril." She laughed softly against his chest. Where would be the excitement in that? In the years that followed, Lucas and Josephine built a life that balanced adventure with stability. Lucas thrived as the Wilson Ranch foreman, eventually becoming a partner in the business when the aging Mr. Wilson decided to reduce his responsibilities. Josephine continued her historical research, corresponding with universities and museums about the artifacts she discovered during their explorations. Together, they mapped extensive portions of the cave system where they had first met, documenting its geological features and archaeological significance. Their findings, published in scientific journals with both their names as contributors, brought a measure of academic recognition that pleased Josephine without changing her fundamental love for the work itself. They welcomed their first child, a son named Thomas after Josephine's father, in the autumn of 1880. A daughter, Eleanor, followed 2 years later, and another son, James, 3 years after that. All 3 children grew up with their parents' love of exploration and learning, accompanying them on expeditions as soon as they were old enough to safely do so. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas surprised Josephine with a special expedition back to the cave where they had met. They left the children with her parents for the day and rode out early, just as they had during their courtship. The cave entrance looked unchanged, a dark mouth in the hillside that had altered the course of their lives a decade earlier. Lucas lit the lanterns with practiced ease, and they made their way inside, following the now familiar path to the chamber where he had first kissed her. There, Lucas had prepared another surprise, a small picnic laid out on a blanket, complete with wine, cheese, bread, and the dried fruit Josephine favored. A book of poetry, Whitman, her favorite, lay beside the meal, along with a small wooden box. "When did you arrange all this?" Josephine asked, delighted by his thoughtfulness. "I rode out at dawn," Lucas admitted, helping her sit on the blanket. "I wanted to celebrate properly in the place where we truly began." They shared the meal by lantern light, reading poems to each other and reminiscing about the past decade, the challenges they had faced together, the joys they had shared, the family they had created. When they had finished eating, Lucas handed Josephine the wooden box. Inside, she found a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a stalactite, inlaid with tiny sapphires that matched her engagement ring. "It's beautiful," she breathed as Lucas fastened it around her neck. "Not nearly as beautiful as you," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "These 10 years have been the greatest adventure of my life, Josephine. Every day with you is a new discovery." Josephine touched the pendant, then leaned forward to kiss her husband, the years having done nothing to diminish the love between them. "The best part is that our adventure is far from over. We have so much left to explore together." As they emerged from the cave into the afternoon sunlight, hand in hand just as they had that first day, Josephine reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. A wrong turn in the darkness, a desperate call for help, a cowboy who followed the sound of her voice, these seemingly random events had led to the richest life she could have imagined. The cave that might have been her tomb had instead become the birthplace of a love that continued to grow, as enduring as the stone formations that had witnessed its beginning, as vibrant as the light they carried into the darkness, and as deep as the passages that still awaited their exploration.